Got it.
Awesome. So thank you all for joining us. In case you missed it, if anyone wants to send their name and where they're joining us from in the chat, that would be great, just so we can get a sense of who's here with us. And then a couple of requests for helping this training run smoothly. Please be sure to stay muted when you're not speaking, just so that we can all hear the speakers. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, and at that point, you can either unmute and share your questions, or you can put them in the chat. I might not see them as I'm presenting or as Elle's presenting, but we'll revisit them at the end of the presentation. So kicking off with some brief introductions, my name is Claire. I'm our Trail Policy Specialist at the Continental Divide Trail Coalition. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. I'm joined by Elle, who will introduce themselves in just a sec when I pass it over to them. And then the other member of our main trail policy team is Teresa Martinez, our Executive Director, who's based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But we also do a lot of policy work with our regional representatives. So our regional reps are Corey Toribio in New Mexico, Jordan Williams in Colorado, and Sierra Labonte in Montana. So you may also hear those folks' names or see them around if you work on any of our side policy work with us. A quick overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. So we're going to start with what the National Trail System is and how legislation affects trails. Then we'll dive into CDTC's legislative priorities and talk about how we work towards those goals. Then I'll share examples of two pieces of legislation that are currently in Congress that would impact the CDT and trails as a whole. And then finally, we'll dive into how you can get involved, and we'll end with some time for a Q&A. I'm going to pass it over to Elle to kick us off.
Awesome. Thank you, Claire. And thank you all for joining us this evening. So great to see some familiar faces and some new ones as well. Like Claire said, I'm Elle Fisher. I'm the Director of Trail Programs here at the Continental Divide Trail Coalition. I'm based up in Helena, Montana. And I've been with the coalition for going on about 5 years now. Actually started in Claire's position as our trail policies manager, and then moved into this position. Just about a year ago. So yeah, super excited to have you all joining with us. The policy and advocacy part of our work is something I'm super passionate about, and I know has been a really engaging part of all the work that we do across the trail. So I'm so excited to be able to talk with you all this morning or this evening, and dig into this topic a little bit further. So like Claire said, we're really going to do a high-level introduction to the National Trail System and impacts to the CDT on that bigger legislative scale. So that's where I'll start. So as you can see from this map, so in 1967, the National Trail System Act established the National Trail System that we have today. So it created the system of continuous long-distance trails with these protected corridors meant to highlight the scenic and natural resources of the continent, as well as the historic routes. So we have national scenic and we have national historic trails. So the CDT was designated as a national scenic trail under the National Scenic Trails Act in 1978, so just 11 years after that initial passage of the National Trail System Act. And today there are 11 national scenic trails, with one being added just last year, one or two, and then 21 national historic trails and over 1,300 national recreation trails. So those are all categories of our national trail system. So similar to a national park or a national forest, each of our national scenic and historic trails is administered by one of the federal agencies. So for example, the CDT is actually administered by the U.S. Forest Service, who the CDTC works very closely with. And while we, as the Forest Service is that main administrator, we also work, with the National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, as well. But this Forest Service is really that main administrator of the CDT. And those administrative agencies oversee the management of the trail. So that includes everything from coordinating across other agencies and private organizations, developing management plans for the corridor and the trail, and a lot more goes into that. But that National Trail System Act originally only designated the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest National Scenic Trails. And then it directed the study of other potential national scenic trails, like the CDT, which then informed, its designation just 11 years later. To be designated as a national scenic trail, we had to start with advocacy, right? Over, just about 50 years ago, there had to be an amendment in that National Trail System Act to designate the CDT. So we started with advocacy, and here we are today, still going on about it. We could spend this whole hour on the mechanics of the National Trail System, but I don't want to bore you folks too much. So I'll start with a really brief explanation to highlight. So the CDT, like I mentioned, is a product of advocacy and legislation. Advocacy is at the heart of the work we do and at the heart of how CDT, is here today with us. And not only is the CDT a product of advocacy, the trail is also the place where it happens. So trails touch on almost every aspect of life in the Rocky Mountain West. If you think about the economic impact of the outdoor recreation economy and what that does for rural communities, that does for jobs and local businesses. If you think about, someone like me who uses the trails to, get out, get some fresh air, and for my own health, just to, enjoy the great outdoors and all the benefits that brings for our public health in our communities. If you think about education, the trail is oftentimes used as a, classroom for teachers to bring out students to learn more about what happens in the great outdoors and science and, ecosystems and wildlife. The CDT and national trails are also a place where people start their careers. I know I started, in the Montana Conservation Corps up here in Montana, and have been working in trails ever since. So, it's not only just that, so when we talk about the legislation for trails or policy for trails, it's not just about that tread, right? Or being able to walk from Mexico to Canada, which is really cool. Um, uh, but it's really about using your voice for trails because of all the different parts of life that the trails supports as well. So really what I want to focus on, throughout this presentation and when you're hearing about all these topics is, not just focusing on the trail, but thinking of trail advocacy is touching on all those things, that all the little pieces of life that the trail impacts as well. Next slide. So legislation impacts a lot of things, as it does, across our lives every day. Legislation impacts a lot of things to do with our national scenic and historic trails, as well. So a couple of the main things that we'll highlight today is, legislation and policy affects funding and staffing for the land management agencies generally and for individual specific trails as well. So each year, the U.S. Forest Service CDT team receives a congressionally appropriated funding. So that's a number that's in that congressional budget that our senators and House representatives talk through every year and try to get across the president's desk. So the CDT team receives a congressionally allocated amount of that funding. And then a small portion of that funding is then allocated to our organizations, CDTC, as well as some other organizations like the Colorado Trail Foundation and others. And then those management agencies also receive funding for staff and projects that support trail maintenance. So that's the development of trailheads and campsite and the staff to make sure, that work is happening on the ground. That funding goes to things like emergency response and search and rescue when there's incidents or emergencies on the trail. And that's a lot of wildfire management, as we all, relate to in the Rocky Mountain West. All that funding goes towards, or a lot of that funding also goes towards wildfire management and mitigation. It goes towards information sharing. So what trails are open, what are the road conditions and things like that. So that funding and staffing for land management agencies isn't necessarily just, digging it in the dirt. It's the ability for people to get out on the trails and access it and have the information they need, to be rescued or, helped if they need it, if there's an incident on the trail. And also it's money that goes towards partners and volunteers to make sure that, this great collaborative effort that we're all doing to steward the CDT remains collaborative. It doesn't all just rely on the shoulders of our agency, partners. There are places where CDTC or volunteers can support, but we need funding and staffing for that in the agencies for that to happen as well. So legislation can also tell federal agencies to prioritize specific projects, goals, or initiatives to prioritize, for example. So a couple of these things that have come up in recent years are things like the Explore Act, which extended the Every Kid in a Park initiative, which provides free passes to national public lands for all fourth grade students. So that, free pass for fourth grade students was a product of legislation getting passed through Congress and a product of advocacy. Legislation can also direct land management agencies, such as the Bureau of Land Management, to prioritize a specific type of energy production on lands that they manage, or to prioritize land use other than, energy production. And then lastly, one thing I'll highlight is elected officials can also use legislation to designate new protected public lands, such as national monuments. So, for example, I'm sure some of you might remember that just a couple of years back, former President Joe Biden established the Camp Hale Continental Divide National Monument in Colorado, which preserves a portion of the Continental Divide landscape, including our trail, as well as a historic military training camp. So this was a decade-long initiative that was originally a piece of legislation known as the CORE Act. And a large part of that work that went into that bill was eventually, hearing and elevating the voices of, local community members so that they're helping really shape what protections in this landscape look like. So that designation from President Biden came out of, a lot of the work that went into working on that piece of legislation, the CORE Act, and working with all the stakeholders, community members, recreationist groups, to make sure that this kind of designation really fit with the character and the protection of the divide. And then lastly, elected officials can use legislation to determine how public lands are protected and managed. So there are bills before Congress right now that handle things like wildfire management. And then there are legislative attempts to do things like repeal or change the plans of Bureau of Land Management offices that, specifically help to guide areas like where the CDT is managed. We crossed 14 BLM resource areas. So, legislative attempts to change those plans can impact what management strategies we can use on the trail. So all that to say, legislation across impacts a lot of things across the trail. The couple examples I mentioned is certainly not all of it, but hopefully gives you, a brief insight into what are some of the top things that legislation impacts in our national trail system. Next slide. And so how does this relate to what we're doing here in CDTC, right? So CDTC's mission is to complete, protect, and elevate the Continental Divide National Scenic Trails. And our legislative priorities aim to help us fulfill this mission. So we currently have three really main legislative priorities, but we also engage in many other pieces of legislation that impact the CDT, that impact trail towns, and that impacts, that wider landscape. Once again, not just looking at the trail tread and that 18 inches of trail tread where you're walking, but really taking in the whole landscape, the communities, that call this place home. And so we currently, like I said, have three main legislative priorities. And we're going to dive a bit more into those two pieces of legislation. So I won't go too deep into that right now. But two of the bills that are currently in Congress that we're working on are the CDT Completion Act. So very much in alignment with CDTC's mission to complete the trail and make sure we do have that continuous walk from Mexico to Canada. So Claire will go a little bit more into the CDT Completion Act. And then we also have the reauthorization of the Legacy Restoration Fund. So as many of you know, that was a piece of legislation that helps us to respond to, deferred maintenance and make sure that we're maintaining the trail when there is deferred maintenance, which I know Claire will go more into, but really is making sure that we're able to, support the agency and actually have, a CDT experience on the ground. If there's downed trees all across the trail, if there's other hazards in the trail, people aren't able to get outdoors, have the CDT experience. So when we talk about protecting the CDT, that maintenance is a huge part of it. So that's where those two pieces of legislation really align directly with our mission. And we know that each of those things, completing the CDT, getting the work done to respond to deferred maintenance, all of that requires strong funding and strong staffing for our trails and for the land agencies that manage those trails. So it all ties in together. And then next slide. And I talk a lot about how we engage with decision makers, specific legislative priorities. But what does that look like actually on the ground when we're talking about all those things? So there are a number of ways that we work toward these legislative priorities. So we're continuously building relationships with elected officials at all levels. and from both sides of the aisle in every CDTC state. So we work with everyone from U.S. senators like Senator Daines here in my senator here in Montana, who's a champion of the CDT Completion Act, to governors, to local land commissioners, county commissioners, as well. So really making sure that we're developing relationships at every level, and making, really building up champions for the CDT at each of those levels. And we've seen, and we are fortunate that the CDT is a notably bipartisan topic with really strong champions from both parties. So as Claire will talk about with the CDT Completion Act, we see a lot of strong bipartisan support, both at the federal and at the state and local level as well. And a lot of this relationship building is all based on, education, simply helping decision makers understand what is the CDT, what are these things we call national scenic trails, and what benefit does it have for their constituents. So a photo on the right shows Representative Vasquez of New Mexico speaking on the CDT Completion Act, and a number of other bills at an event we hosted at Trail Day. So we were really, really fortunate to have Representative Vasquez come out to one of our events, talk directly to community members to hear why this is important, and really helps to elevate the CDT and what he's doing to champion completion in Congress. And then we also do, a very small amount of direct advocacy and lobbying for specific bills, like I mentioned, the CDT Completion Act. So since we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, the amount of time we do, very direct asking for support of a specific bill is very, very small. We really lean into that education space. How can we help decision makers know more about the CDT so that they can make those informed decisions, right? And the National Trails System, one of the biggest tools, in our, toolbox is that we have this huge shared voice across the country. If you remember that map, of all the trails across the country, almost every single corner of the continent is touched. And so when we talk about the power of our shared voice, that is really, that shared voice does span the entire nation. So that is why building a network of trail supporters, folks like yourselves who are joining today, is so important for the CDT and pushing forward with this mission to complete, protect, and elevate the trail. So it's hugely important to build, to have conversations like this so that we're able to have, local champions who know the trail in their own backyards. The impacts, community members know the impacts of, the trail and all the benefits it brings to their communities. First and foremost, they're the experts. And so really elevating local voices so that, we're being responsive to the needs on the ground when we're talking to decision makers. It's also important to demonstrate to elected officials that the CDT is important to folks along the trail. So that's why we, really are trying to create this strong network of voices, not only along the trail, but across the country so that, our elected officials are hearing trails are important to people across the nation. It's important to your constituents. And this advocacy and this education can take a lot of forms and look a lot of different ways, like I mentioned. But the most important first step is simply showing up, which is what you all are doing today. So, like I said, super appreciate you all joining today. Really, this is the most important step, is just doing the work of showing up and learning more. So super appreciate you all taking time this evening. And now I'll pass it back over to Claire to go over some of the examples and go into some of the specifics here that I talked about today.
So I'm going to dive into the two bills that Elle mentioned in our legislative priorities. We'll start with the CDT Completion Act, and then we'll talk about reauthorization of the Legacy Restoration Fund, which is through a bill called the America the Beautiful Act. So starting with the CDT Completion Act, the Continental Divide Trail Completion Act directs the Secretaries of Agriculture and the Interior to create a CDT completion team of staff from the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service, and that team would be tasked with completing the CDT within 10 years of enactment of the CDT Completion Act. So going a little bit into why this is necessary, nearly 50 years after the CDT was designated as a National Scenic Trail, about 160 miles of the trail are still what we call gap areas. So those are areas that are routed on busy roadways or highways. They're marked here on this map. They're present in all 5 CDT states, and these areas are not safe they're not scenic, and they're not what the National Trail System Act designated when they created the CDT. So trail completion to us means rerouting these gaps onto safe, protected, and scenic trails. And this really benefits both hikers who are seeking a continuous footpath from New Mexico to Montana. I know road walks are unpopular, but it also benefits communities. Rerouting these gap areas improves access to trails and public lands for the communities that the CDT passes through. So here in Colorado, for example, the Muddy Pass Gap is a 15-mile gap outside the community of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And that community has been really active in completing the trail and in completing that gap because it'll improve access for them and trail access for their community. So some key points about the CDT Completion Act. First off, the CDT Completion Act does not directly authorize any spending, and it does not include any land acquisition. It also states that eminent domain will not be used to complete the CDT. So the combo of all three of those factors is that the CDT Completion Act is a congressional intent bill. Essentially, the CDT Completion Act is Congress asking agencies to move completing the CDT up their to-do list a bit. And so you might be wondering, if there is no land acquisition, no eminent domain, and no spending in the bill, how does completion occur? Completion would occur through the use of easements, land exchanges, and land sales from willing sellers. So that willing seller piece is what indicates that eminent domain will never be used to complete the CDT. And those land exchanges, sales, and easements would mainly occur through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which I'll actually dive into pretty deep in our next example. And something that we really center at the CDTC in completion is landowners and local communities. So like I mentioned with the community of Steamboat or with the communities that have gap areas, we always prioritize ensuring that the reroute solution that we come up with is locally supported and is supported by the surrounding landowners. And then a question we get a lot about the CDT Completion Act, particularly in the last several months, is with what funding or with what staffing? And I just want to say that we at CDTC recognize that the legislative priority that we shared of funding and staffing for land management agencies is crucial to completing the CDT. All of the priorities that we shared go hand in hand, and we know that this isn't feasible without well-funded and well-staffed land management agencies. So this bill doesn't by any means assume that we don't need those other things that we are advocating for. A little bit of history about the bill. The CDT Completion Act was first introduced by Representative Neguse from Colorado in August of 2021. It's in the 117th session of Congress. And during that session, it was referred to the House Natural Resources Committee, where it received a hearing and a markup, but it never left the committee. In the next session of Congress, the 118th session, the bill was introduced in the House and the Senate bicamerally by Representative Neguse, and then in the Senate by Senators Daines of Montana and Senator Heinrich of New Mexico. And in that session of Congress, it was reported favorably out of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, but it never received a full chamber vote. And in our current session of Congress, the 119th session, the bill was reintroduced in both the House and the Senate this April, and it was sponsored by Senators Martin Heinrich and Steve Daines and Representatives Joe Neguse and Teresa Ledger Fernandez. So what comes next? The CDT Completion Act has been referred to the committees. So in the Senate, that's the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. In the House, that's the House Natural Resources Committee. And these committees will now consider the CDT Completion Act. Committees can make changes to the bill, and then they'll vote on whether to report it to the full House or Senate. If they vote to report it to the full chamber, it'll be heard by the entire House or Senate, and members will debate and then vote on the bill. If it passes in one chamber, the process then has to occur in the other chamber. And if it passes both chambers, but there are differences in their versions of the bill, which we've seen some slight differences in previous sessions. Right now, the bill has the same version in both chambers. But if there are differences in a bill that passes in both chambers, it goes to what's called a conference committee, who creates a kind of compromise version that both chambers then vote on. If the bill passes both chambers, it's sent to the president, who signs or vetoes the bill. Obviously, if the president signs it, it becomes law. If the president vetoes it, a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers can overturn that veto. So we're going to talk at the end about how to get involved, specifically on the CDT Completion Act. But really what we're working on right now is continuing momentum for this bill and making sure that after introduction, legislators from along the trail and across the country really are hearing that it's important to folks so that it continues to move, so that it moves through committee, so that it receives votes. Really just keeping up excitement about that bill, because we're certainly excited about it. So we want to keep that up in DC as well. Now I'm going to dive into our other legislative priority, reauthorization of the Legacy Restoration Fund. But to talk about that, I want to give a little bit of history about a bill called the Great American Outdoors Act, or GAOA. GAOA was a really huge bill that passed in 2020 that impacts public lands and trails across the country, not just the CDT. And reauthorization of the Legacy Restoration Fund would be crucial to all public lands and all trails across the country. So this really isn't a CDT specific bill. This is something we're working on hand in hand with partners across the national trail system and across the conservation and outdoor recreation communities across the country. So the Great American Outdoors Act was introduced in March of 2020, and after introduction, it gained 60 bipartisan co-sponsors. That's a ton, obviously, and it passed the House and Senate in June of that year and was signed into law by President Trump in June of 2020. I think that timeline is pretty crucial because obviously, a lot else was going on in spring of 2020. And I think the fact that this bill gained bipartisan support at such a busy time demonstrates how crucial it was to lawmakers from across the country and from all political parties. There are two main components of the Great American Outdoors Act: the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Restoration Fund, which we'll call the LRF, or the Legacy Restoration Fund. The Land and Water Conservation Fund was first created in 1964, and in the years since, it has enabled conservation and outdoor recreation opportunities in every county across the nation. So this can range from large projects to protect natural or cultural resources to small bike paths, neighborhood parks. No matter what county you live in, there's an LWCF project somewhere near you. And the Land and Water Conservation Fund does this by directing federal government revenues from fossil fuel extraction into a fund that's then distributed to federal agencies and state and local governments to do these projects. So in 2019, the Land and Water Conservation Fund was permanently reauthorized, but it wasn't permanently funded, which meant that it was vulnerable to political gridlock that we often see over appropriations and budgeting. So in the Great American Outdoors Act the following year, it was permanently authorized at a mandatory allocation of about $900 million a year. So this is not only a significant increase from previous allocations, still funded from fossil fuel extraction revenue, but it also ensures that land can continue to be protected on local and national levels for years to come without being vulnerable during the budgeting process. The second half of the Great American Outdoors Act was establishing the Legacy Restoration Fund. So the Legacy Restoration Fund, when it was created, the Great American Outdoors Act authorized up to $1.9 billion per year from 2021 to 2025 to fund deferred maintenance on public lands. So deferred maintenance are projects that weren't undertaken when the issue arose due to a lack of funds or a lack of staff, things like that. And as of March of 2024, $2.4 billion had been allocated to projects under the Legacy Restoration Fund, which is the most recent data that we have available. And this includes projects in national parks along the CDT. So the Legacy Restoration Fund has funded road, bridge, and water system rehabilitation in Glacier National Park. It's funded historic structure restoration in Yellowstone, and it's funded campsite improvements in Rocky Mountain National Park. And the Legacy Restoration Fund is funded by revenue from all sorts of energy extraction on public lands. So coal, oil, and natural gas, but also renewable energy projects. And both components of the Great American Outdoors Act have huge implications for completing the CDT and maintaining a trail that is safe and enjoyable. So like I mentioned before, the Land and Water Conservation Fund is one of the greatest tools that we have for closing gaps in the CDT. So LWCF grants are the primary source of funding for land acquisition or easements needed for rerouting those gaps. One example of this is in 2016, the Land and Water Conservation Fund enabled the purchase of nearly 5,000 acres of land near Grants, New Mexico. And on that land, the CDT was rerouted off of a dangerous roadwalk or a portion of a road walk onto that newly acquired land. And in doing so, hunters also gained access to a large area of big game tract, which I think kind of goes to show that these grants benefit the CDT, but they also benefit the local communities through improved access to land, improved outdoor recreation opportunities. And that's part of why in a 2019 survey that we conducted at CDTC, 98% of small business owners surveyed in the 5 CDT states supported full funding for LWCF. So we know that when the Great American Outdoors Act permanently funded the LWCF, that was a broadly popular policy in the CDT states. The other half of the Great American Outdoors Act, the Legacy Restoration Fund, will be really huge for improving on-the-ground conditions for the CDT. So the U.S. Forest Service CDT program applied for $4.8 million under the Legacy Restoration Fund to address deferred maintenance on the CDT in New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. That agreement is moving through governmental systems right now, but we're optimistic that the Forest Service CDT team will receive it in the coming months, sometime this year. And we at CDTC will match a portion of that funding for a total investment of about $6 million in the CDT. And this map on the right side of the slide here shows the breakdown of the miles of trail that will be improved and maintained under this funding, organized by National Forest. So some examples of what this will mean for the CDT. This will include removal of downed trees, construction of connector trails, and then LRF funding across the country and throughout these states will generally mean improvements of the visitor centers, the campgrounds, and the other facilities on all of the public lands through which the CDT passes. I think beyond the trail, it's really important to drive home that this funding is also just an investment in the rural communities that the CDT passes through. So jobs will be created to do all of this work, and maintaining these public lands that are so crucial to the outdoor recreation economies of these small communities. The Legacy Restoration Fund is really an investment, not just in the tread of the trail, but in the communities that care for it and in all the lands that it passes through. So as you might recall, I mentioned that the Legacy Restoration Fund is set to expire at the end of fiscal year 2025, so this year. And as you can see from the chart here, only a small portion of the funds needed for deferred maintenance were supplied through the Legacy Restoration Fund. So while the LRF was a huge investment in public lands, as of about a year ago, only $2.4 billion had been allocated under the Legacy Restoration Fund, whereas at the same time, the estimated need for deferred maintenance on all American public lands was $23 billion. So there's still obviously a huge gap in funding needed to address this deferred maintenance. And this is in part, this buildup of deferred maintenance is in part due to rapidly growing visitation to our public lands over the last 20 years, paired with pretty stagnant federal land management agency budgets over the same time period. So if this need isn't addressed, these deferred maintenance needs will only continue to grow. The America the Beautiful Act, which is the bill that CDTC is supporting, would reauthorize the Legacy Restoration Fund for an additional 8 years, so through 2033, at $2 billion per year. And the goal of the America the Beautiful Act is really to eventually eliminate deferred maintenance so that agencies can focus on timely maintenance. This isn't meant to be something that occurs in perpetuity. This is something we could catch up on, hypothetically. So this bill would be really crucial, like I've mentioned, for all trails across the country that experience deferred maintenance, and also for the visitor centers, the campgrounds, the roads, the historic structures along these public lands. So the America the Beautiful Act was recently reintroduced in this session of Congress, sponsored by Senator Steve Daines of Montana, with 7 bipartisan co-sponsors, including Republican Senator Tim Sheehy from Montana and Democratic Senator John Hickenlooper from Colorado. And I just like to highlight this list of co-sponsors. I think it really goes to show the bipartisan nature of public lands and the opportunity they offer us for collaboration right now. And so with that, I'm going to kind of segue into how you can get involved in supporting these bills now that you've heard about the things in front of Congress right now that could impact public lands. So the first place I would direct you is to our CDT Action Center, and I'll send you a link to that tomorrow. But the CDT Action Center is really our hub for all things policy and advocacy. And the biggest thing that I would encourage everyone to consider doing on the Action Center right now is this orange box here, signing on in support of the CDT Completion Act. So collecting these individual sign-ons or business sign-ons if you represent a business or an organization really helps us show elected officials along the trail and also across the country that this bill is important to folks. So far, we have sign-ons in 25 states. So we're really working on demonstrating that this is really important and the CDT is a national resource. On the Action Center, you can also find information on contacting your elected officials, particularly if you live in a CDT state. You can sign up to receive our advocacy alerts, which is how I reach out when there are moments where we're looking for folks to speak up in support of the CDT. We also share news and information through those. We also use this to list public comment periods so that you can keep an eye on what's happening in the management of the public lands near you and that the CDT runs through. And then finally, we have a ton of resources on this page. And that really leads me to the next thing that I would encourage you all to do, which is learn more and educate others. I've found that a lot of these topics come up really naturally when you're on a trail and you see deferred maintenance or you cross into a specific type of land designation. And just knowing about how legislation impacts trails and sharing that with other folks builds the base of trail advocates. And we have a ton of resources available on our Action Center to help you do that. So in the tools and resources section, we have one-pagers on each of the bills that we talked about tonight. And we also have our congressional report, which is an annual report that we put out that discusses our policy priorities. It gives a lot of information on our return on investment on federal funding. And it also talks about some of the highlights that we achieved the previous year. The news section of our Advocacy Center also includes more timely updates on our policy work. We'll have some news coming out soon about a lot of the stateside wins that we saw for conservation this year, or we'll dive into recaps of visits to DC, things like that. The other way that I would encourage you to get involved in advocating for the CDT or for trails or for public lands and staffing more generally is to contact your elected officials. So if you live in a CDT state, their contact information is listed on our Action Center. And if you don't, it's really easy to find via Google. That is public information. You can just put in representative and then their contact info or senator and contact info. And you'll find phone, you'll find email, and you can even send physical mail. If you want to send a postcard from some public lands that you really love, you can do that. So when do you contact your elected officials? There's a handful of times that you can do that. I'll plug our advocacy alerts again. A few times a year, we do reach out to folks, letting them know that it's a really good time to reach out for some specific bill or some specific ask in support of the CDT. But you can also contact your elected officials anytime. It is their job to hear what constituents have to say and take that into consideration. And I'll say that in recent weeks and months, we have really seen both Republicans and Democrats take strong stances in support of public lands. And I think in part that's because they know how important that is to their constituents. And they're hearing from their constituents that public lands and staffing land management agencies matter to them. So you can contact your elected officials in support of a specific bill. You can also contact them generally to express your support for public lands, or you can contact them to share impacts of recent federal actions on the public lands around you. So if you are seeing changes in staffing or funding, if you're seeing closed facilities, or if you personally have been impacted, you can share that story with your elected officials. When we visited DC in February, we overwhelmingly heard from offices that they want to hear the stories of how all of the current actions on public lands are impacting their constituents. So call them and let them know. A couple tips for how to do that. Be as succinct as you can while sharing your message effectively. Offices get a lot of calls and emails, so you want to be sure that they're able to figure out what your main message is. And going off of that, if you are contacting them about a specific bill, be sure to name it and be clear about what you're saying in regards to that bill. And then finally, don't be afraid to share your story. Like we said, be personal, share how changes are impacting you or why something is important to you. You can also invite your local or all of your elected officials onto the trail. So this goes for everyone from your county commissioner to your senator or representative in DC to a member of your local city council. You can invite the individual themselves. You can also look up, particularly for your elected officials in DC, who their in-district or natural resources staff members are, and work with someone who focuses really specifically on your area or on natural resources. And having visits like this builds awareness about the CDT and connection to it, as well as to all public lands and trails, and it helps decision makers understand the importance of this resource to your community. Also, it's fun. It's a really nice way for them to get to mix up their time a little bit. And you can also consider inviting elected officials to trail-related events. Like Elle mentioned, this photo in the center here is Representative Gabe Vasquez speaking at Trail Days this year. The photo on the left is Senator Bennett from Colorado and President Biden speaking at the Camp Hale Continental Divide National Monument designation. And the photo on the right here is Representative Neguse visiting the Muddy Pass Gap. So when you can have an opportunity like that to share with elected officials the impacts, what it looks like for a hiker having a road walk on the Muddy Pass, things like that, that really helps them understand what it is that you're advocating for and why it's important. And finally, there are always more opportunities to get involved. If you live in one of our 21 CDT Gateway communities, and you can find that list on our website, you can consider joining your local Gateway Community Committee. So these committees lead local CDT events, they increase awareness for the trail, and they build community support and engagement around the trail, which really is advocating for the trail at a very local level. These committees also sometimes help with local level policy that impacts the CDT, like local proclamations in support of the CDT, things like that that really drive awareness and bring up the importance of the CDT within your community. We're also by far not the only group doing this work. We partner with a lot of local trail organizations, and I'd encourage you to look into those groups and look into how you can be involved with them in advocating for trails in your community specifically. And then finally, reach out to us if you want to do more. I'm going to share my information on the next slide, but we work with a number of CDT advocates to do all sorts of types of advocacy, including speaking at public meetings, writing letters to the editor, participating in land management processes. So if there is some specific way that matches your skills and your interests that you want to get involved, please do reach out to me. So with that, thank you for joining us. My email is on this slide, and I'm going to stop sharing so that we can transition over to any questions that folks